Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the last session of the International Macrohistory Online Seminar of this semester. And today we're going to have a presentation by Fabio Braggion and Nick Schaub, although this is a paper with four co-authors on the long-term effects of inflation on inflation expectation using data from the German hyperinflation of the 1920s. Before I give the floor to the presenters, let me just quickly remind you of our rules of engagement. If you have burning clarification questions, please write them in the Q&A space, and I will interrupt the speakers. If there are, on the other hand, substantive questions, you can type them or reserve and raise your hand at the end of the presentation. So the speakers will have up to 40 minutes to present the paper. Then we'll have a first 20 minutes for Q&A, and then if the discussion so continues, an extra 15 minutes. So with no further ado, I'll pass the baton to Fabio. Fabio, you can upload your slides.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for having us here. And I think you should see my screen now.
We do.
Okay, great. So thanks again for having me here. And this is a paper with Felix from Meyerinck at University of Zurich, Nick, who is also online, Nick Schaub at the WHU, Otto Science School of Management, and Michael Weber at the WHU School of Business in Chicago. So what is this paper about? The paper wants to see whether inflation surges in the distant past affect current expectations about on households inflation, from households to inflation. And if this is the case that surges of inflation in the distant past affect current inflation expectations, we would like to understand what are the channels. And we see we can do this by looking at Germany in the 1920s, that's going to be the historical part, and today when we look at inflation expectations. Motivation. So why do we believe that this is interesting and important? Well, we all know here that inflation is back, or at least was back, now is receding, although relatively at a slower pace vis-a-vis what the policymaker would like to have. But we saw that at least in 2021 and 2022, the level of inflation in the United States, but also in Europe, went back to levels that we saw only in the 1980s. So the policy question on how to tackle inflation is back on the agenda. And this is also a paper on inflation expectations as a policy tool. So here a couple of quotes from the Fed. One is from the president of the Fed itself, which says that in our thinking, inflation expectations are the most important driver of actual realized inflation. Another one basically says that one of the new goals of policymaker is monitoring and managing actual household and consumer expectations about inflation. So we already know that from current literature that personal experiences during your own lifetime of inflation may have an impact on your inflation expectations. And you see here now in this graph, the blue line, the red line, the green line, these are all graphs of inflation expectations starting in 2013 per quarter for a sample of US households. And you see the blue line, these are younger people who are less exposed about inflation. And in fact, we have lower inflation expectation vis-a-vis the older that probably lived through the 1980s or 1970s and saw more inflation throughout their lives. Yet, and here comes the yellow-orange line, everybody has inflation expectations that tend to be higher vis-a-vis what is the actualized inflation. COVID may be being an exception, but you see that once the inflation recedes, expectations tend to be stickier in adjusting vis-a-vis the decline in inflation. So the idea is, looks like there is something on top of personal experiences that may explain why there is always an upward bias of inflation expectation vis-a-vis what is the actual realized rate. So other motivational evidence. So we took inflation expectations from a bunch of countries, and this is just take them as correlation. And we divide these countries in Europe and North America. And we divide this inflation expectation between countries that experienced hyperinflation before the 1930s and countries that did not experience hyperinflation during the 1930s. And this is for the year 1922. And as you can see, inflation expectations are significantly larger in countries that experienced hyperinflation before the 1930s vis-à-vis the other group of countries. When we look at the realized inflation in 1922, in 2022, sorry, so this is 2022, of course, we see that realized inflation actually doesn't differ much between countries that did experience hyperinflation before the 1930s and countries that did not experience hyperinflation before the 1930s. So the idea is maybe there is a long-run effect of previous inflation experiences in a country that may affect how expectations are formed in the same country these days. So we like to look at this, we call it the long-run effect of inflations. And if you want to study this carefully, we believe that you need to tackle a few empirical challenges, in particular two. In principle, we like to have a country that experienced high inflation in the distant past, where we have, at least anecdotically, we know that people had a good memory of the past inflation that in a way lived throughout generations. And then, of course, we like to have granular data of local historical inflation in the past, as well as current inflation expectations. And we're going to look at Germany, because I think we know that Germany in the 1920s had a very important high inflation, hyperinflation episodes. And you will see we have lots of data also for today about current inflation expectations. So you will see, in fact, that this environment will allow us to have distant past experience of high inflation, again, the experience of the 1920s, which is still very lively today. So this is a picture that actually Nick took last year around Frankfurt when we were local elections. And you see now in English, making inflation small again was an important part of a party's political agenda. These are the Free Democrats on now pushing to rein in inflation. But even without looking at the current political agenda, we saw this is a quote from the Financial Times from a banker commenting about the more recent European Central Bank policies about now mutualizing debt or buying, printing money to buy government debt. So the comment was, I hesitate to go back to the 1920s, but after the First and Second World Wars, Germany found out when central banks finance state spending, it destroyed the currency. And this is Jörg Kramer, which was then, during the interview, chief economist of Commerzbank. The experience of hyperinflation is somewhat very important for us in the DNA here. So Germans do not want to see the ECB buying government bonds. And then from the New York Times, more on the personal transmission of experience. Norbert Schulze was not yet born when hyperinflation of the 1920 deeply scarred the German psyche. But he still remembers when the Reichsmark notes, denominated in millions and billions, the yearly letters were tucked into a box with the family's old black and white photograph. This gives the idea that the experience of the 1920s, at least again anecdotically, are still pretty much alive into the German social conscious, if you want to call it like that. So first empirical challenges. You will have a country that has a distant past experience of high inflation, which again is lived again and again and remembered. And Germany, in a way, fits this type of idea. Then we would like to have, first of all, information or good data, as I said. And Germany also fits this because we have information or local historical inflation that displays large variation throughout time and across location, across the cities you will see. And we also have very good data on individual inflation expectations today that can be related to the experience of the 1920s. And this is a bit of a preview of our results. So on the horizontal line, I divide cities in buckets of inflation in the 1920s. One, these are cities that experience, relatively to the others, low inflation in the 1920s, to a higher 3, 4, and 5 being the bucket of city, the quintile of city with the highest inflation in the 1920s. On the vertical axis, I plot the average inflation expectations today of people living in the same cities. And you see now that there is a positive correlation between 1920 inflation in the city and expected inflation rate of people living in the same cities today. Of course, this is just a correlation, which we are going to explore more, you will see later with our empirical analysis. So overall, we find a positive relationship between 1920s local inflation and current household inflation expectations. And if you want to have an idea of economic significance, this is important because if we move from a quintile, as we saw before, the lowest 1920 realized inflation to the highest quintile, inflation expectations goes up of 7.7 percentage points, which if I normalize to the average realized inflation today corresponds even to 90%. Then we also find that in terms of political views, households in areas that have higher historical inflation, higher inflation again in the 1920s, tend to prioritize, we would like politicians to prioritize the fight against inflation in respect to other political goals. So you see, we're going to use yet another survey that looks at this type of things. But we also see that historical inflation historical inflation affects current expectation, both because there is an evidence of some sort of intergenerational transmission between father to son, but also because of the role of collective memories. Think about collective memories as things that are external to the families, but internal to society. So in the point, we're going to look a little bit more through the channel. How is it possible that people still remember inflation of a 1920 today, that experience? Part of it will be due into families, households, how things are transmitted within the households, but also the role of collective memories. We have some tests to try to document that. And then we'll see also that individuals living in the high 1920 inflation areas invest less in debt in bonds. Very brief historical introduction. So how did Germany end up with very high inflation during the 1920s? Well, Germany entered World War I, and like many other countries, already the financing of the war brought inflation. Germany lost the war. Upon losing the war, Germany had plenty of financial, as a result of losing the war, Germany had plenty of financial obligations. They had to pay pensions to war veterans, they have war loans to be repaid, the important issue of a reparation, but also running the state, because Germany was already, for instance, giving old age pensions. So how to find the money to meet all these expenditures? So tax collection was very problematic because Germany was an empire, became a republic. The republic was torn apart by fights and possible revolutions in different lenders and different states. So tax collection was problematic. Germany lost the war, so personal income was low. Germany, in a way, was the bad guy right after World War I, so was cut out from the international debt market. And the only thing that was left was indeed printing money, which led to very high inflation rates. Let me just show you. So here I have, again, as you can see, time, years, and I'm starting 1910, before the war, and I'm stopping 1920. And the solid line is Germany, or better, the German CPI. And then, and then the dotted line is the average inflation of other countries in the world. And the dashed line is the other countries in the world. And the dotted line is the US. And you see that until the end of the war, Germany is the behavior of CPI in Germany is very similar to the behavior that you have in the rest of the world. Only after 1919, especially 1920, Germany decouples, the CPI of Germany decouples from the average of the rest of the world. And that's so very important for us. 1920 turns out to be the first year where, at least nationally, prices are doubling. Inflation is higher than 100%. Why did I stop here in 1920? Because if I want to go beyond 1920, I really need a different scale on the y-axis. As you can see, this is 1920. The difference that you saw in the graph before, they become very, very flat. Because after 1922, the second year after 1920, where inflation more than double, where CPI more than double, inflation was more than 100%, prices went totally very much out of control, especially in 1923. And then you see later on, 1924, this is the stabilization policy that brought a halt to the high inflation rates. And this is, you see, a full decoupling vis-a-vis the rest of the world or the United States alone. So with this idea in mind, we just bring in this simple idea to the data with a very simple equation. This is the baseline. You will have on the left-hand side a measure of expected inflation of individual I at time t, which you relate to the local inflation in the 1920s experienced by the city where the individual I lives, again in the 1920s. And then a bunch of control and the error too. Expected inflation is measured again via surveys. We are going to have many surveys to explore. 1 year ahead, expected inflation of households I or individual I at time t. And the inflation in the 1920s will be measured either with the log of cumulative inflation between 1920 and 24, but also we're going to discretize the measure by looking at deciles of cumulative inflation. And then you have a bunch of household controls, which depends on the type of survey that we use, and historical control. For instance, the unemployment rate in the city between 1920 and 24, whether the city had a branch of a then central bank, and whether the city was in an area that was occupied by the French or the Belgian army. Data, so very important here. So local inflation data in the 1920s. These data were compiled already back then by the German Statistical Office. So the idea was the Department of Labor wanted to have a base to start a base of information of local prices to be used to mediate between workers and entrepreneurs the wage negotiations. So the data is available at a monthly frequency already starting in January 1920. And this type of statistical analysis was done. Statistical records were collected for every German town that at least had 10,000 inhabitants, which are more than 500 towns in Germany. And this is a little bit how the data looks like today. So here even, these are various areas of Berlin. So for very big cities, even pieces of a city were considered different by the statistical office, and local prices were recorded. And this is the population in this particular, in each of the areas. And these, for instance, are the prices recorded in January 1921, where the base year is January 1914. This is July 1921. This is August 1921, September 1921. Then the same information is reported, but the base year is considered, because here we're talking about 1921, January 1921, which is considered 100, and every other price for July, August, and September is expressed in using January 1921 as base year. This is the geographical distribution of our inflation rates. So the white dots are the cities, and we demark areas with very high inflation with a very dark black, and the milder becomes the black, the more grayish or whiter becomes the black, the lower is inflation. We see there is high inflation in the south, but also in other areas like Berlin, or more towards the Ruhr part and the west of the Saarland. And then second part of the data, we're going to use inflation surveys. So Germany today runs many surveys that try to elicit inflation expectation information from people living there, from households and individuals. Each survey has different characteristics. So the JFK is the first survey we use. It runs from 2013 to 2017, looks at a representative sample of 2,000 households. It doesn't have a panel structure, but it's a sequence of repeated cross-sections, which is a limitation. Of course, a good thing about this is that we know a lot about where the household or the individual is located, because we have information even at zip code level. There is a PHF survey, which has the drawback that uses only 1 year, 2014, but a larger cross-section of households, and you will see ask more questions, for instance, financial decision of households. And then a first survey, the BOPHH, which runs for 2-3 years, April 20 to March 2022, and it has a panel structure, which makes it nice because you can trace back the individual, and you can follow an individual and households throughout time. So we're going to use all of them. I will not show you every single result with every survey, otherwise it will take too long. Results, in any case, robust on the type of survey that we use. And talk about results, this is the first one. So here I'm using the first survey, the JFK, the repeated cross-section ones, where you have good data about the location of the individual. dependent variable again is my expected inflation rates. And you see I always have a positive relationship between local inflation, either measured with a log of cumulative inflation of with sequence of inflation deciles, and statistically significant relationship between local inflation in the 1920s and expected inflation today. This is also resistant even if I control for county time fixed effects. So by looking at everything about specific county where a city is located, they may change throughout time. In terms of economic significance, I think the results are also important. So a 1% increase in 1920 inflation leads to a 0.035 percentage points increase in expected inflation today, which corresponds to a 0.90 increase on inflation expectations of our households today. So a 1% increase in inflation in the 1920 leads to a 0.9% increase of inflation expectations of people in this survey today, which is, I believe, sizable. And again, if I try this regression with the other two surveys, results are in line. Second point, so which inflationary period matters? So is the full experience of the 1920s that matter to and affects inflation expectations today, or some periods are more important than others? So the memory of inflation could be strongest in areas, for instance, that experience higher inflation first, because these people saw inflation for the first time, they did not expect it, they didn't have time to get prepared, so they may have experienced a larger erosion of their wealth as a result of prices getting higher. And we also have experienced maybe more important or sudden changes in their daily life. So what we do is we run a regression which is very similar to the baseline that you saw before, but we compute cumulative inflation of our inflation decile index for each year in the 1920s. So we'll have cumulative inflation as experienced in the 1920, 21, 22, 23, 24, and the same for inflation deciles. And we see that what matters in explaining inflation today, expected inflation today, is actually inflation in the 1920 and in 1922, which you might remember from the graph that I showed you before. These are the first 2 years where inflation went above 100%, more than double, suggesting that cities that experience the highest inflation first are actually the cities where people today tend to remember them more, and their inflation expectation to be the most affected by the experience of the 1920s. When you look also at inflation deciles, results are similar, with 1920 and 1922 being positive and statistically significant, more statistically significant for 1920 with a 1% degree. Then you're going to look also at alternative explanation. For instance, you may think maybe that historical inflation is actually not measuring inflation expectations, but is actually a proxy of local realized inflation that fits into the inflation expectations we pick up in the survey. So unfortunately, these days, we don't have any more local realized inflation data in Germany. So what we did, we use price from one of the largest supermarkets in Germany, Rewe, the second largest. And for the time period of June, September 2022, we scraped from the internet all the prices that the supermarket had online, so for all the products that are sold there, in all the locations where we have in Germany, constructing, using the data based on the supermarket, local CPI by looking again at this type of data. So we computed this realized inflation on a 12 weeks window, again, by looking at the prices downloaded from the scrape by the website of a supermarket. Then I think we can think about maybe there is historical inflation is a proxy for other macroeconomic expectations, which then fits into our inflation expectation measure. So you will see we're going to relate our historical inflation measures, the 1920-24, to today's macroeconomic experience and expectations. So when you look at realized inflation, again, dependent variable realized inflation in a certain city today, as obtained from the prices of the supermarket, were related to the local inflation between 1920 and 1924. And we never find a statistically significant with signs that are flip-flopping depending on becoming positive or negative depending on the specifications, we don't find any significant relationship or strong relationship between local inflation in 1920-24 and realized inflation today, suggesting that local inflation in the 1920s is not correlated with realized inflation today. Then we look at other macroeconomic expectations and we relate them, as I told you before, to local inflation in the 1920s. And what are these other expectations? Expected inflation for the real estate where the individual live, expected interest rate, expected stock returns, but we don't find any statistical significant relationship between inflation, historical inflation, and these other expectations. We move on. We try to understand also whether the experience of the 1920s in a way pushes people to have different political preferences in regard to what they would like the government to do. So we look at a fourth survey, which is called the SUP survey, and which is a bit more sociological, more looking about more political variables, which in 1996, 2006, and 2016 asked to their own people who were surveys to rank the relative importance of 4 political goals. The first one was fighting against inflation. Then you have other goals, maintaining peace and order, increasing citizen influence and improving the governance, protecting the right of free speech. So we constructed a dummy that takes a value of 1 if a respondent put fight against inflation as her own priority or his own priority when ranking all these political goals. And these are the results. So we always observe a positive and statistically significant relationship. We always observe, a positive relationship between the local inflation in 1920s and having the individual to rank number 1 the political goal of having the government to fight against inflation, which becomes also statistically significant when we control for county time fixed effects. Then I already jump into mechanism and channels. We want to understand why people are, so if you believe that inflation expectations today are affected by the experience of the 1920s, we want to understand why people remember, what possible mechanism can lead to have an historical experience of basically 100 years ago to have an effect on expectations today. So 2 things we are looking into. One is what we call intergenerational transmission. So if we're going to look and see whether the results are different from households that have an immigration background. In principle, if you believe that this is a phenomenon that is carried on, the memory is carried on within the family, you may expect the families that migrated from other places, from other countries into the city, not to have this type of effect, to be less likely to be affected by the experience of a 1920, to have their expectation to be less likely to be affected by the experience of a 1920s. And then we're going to look at collective memories. So whether society and anything that is outside the family has a system in place that in a way or another keeps the historical memory alive within the community. And we're going to look at 2 things. The role of politicians. Politicians may keep on reminding their own constituency that they had an important experience of high inflation in the 1920s, and hence inflation is bad. They could do this because their own constituency wants to hear this type of speech, or maybe they are born in the same constituency themselves, and they want to, they have this into themselves, and they want to promote it. That could be a possibility. The other is, we look at the role of local media, whether local media in a way also have an effect in transmitting and keeping alive the experience of the 1920s, so the memory keeps on going. For the first mechanism, so we look at one of the surveys which ask whether some information about family background of a respondent. In particular, is asking whether the parents of the respondents were born abroad, or the respondent herself himself was born abroad. So what you see that in terms of baseline, if people are not born abroad, if a respondent is not born abroad, I still see a positive relationship between inflation in the 1920 and expected inflation rate. But the relationship becomes mute, fundamentally 0, if the respondents have either parents born abroad, notice the negative coefficient on the interaction term, or he himself is born abroad, suggesting that again this historical effect of inflation expectations tend to be muted for individuals that have an immigration background and most likely didn't have experience within the family of the 1920s inflation. Then we're going to look again at this idea of social collective memory. So as I told you, politicians can shape collective memories and priorities in various ways. Maybe they promote their own priority and the fight against inflation could be one of their own priorities. Or maybe they cater to the priorities of their own constituency. And the constituency maybe is made of people that care a lot about fighting inflation. So what you do with this very interesting data that you can download online, it's called opendiscourse.org, where every speech that has been given in the German parliament has been recorded. And when I say every speech, I mean every speech. So we analyze all the speeches and we drop every statement which had less than 250 words. In other words, fundamentally, I'm defining a meaningful speech within the parliament, any statement that has at least 250 words. Then we count the number of speeches that contain at least once a word inflation. Of course, you can do all this in different ways. We just did it by counting, by seeing whether a speech contains a word inflation at least once. So what do we find here? We find that politicians that have been elected in constituency that experienced high inflation in the 1920s, they tend to make more speeches that have the word inflation into it. This is on the cross-section. And again, this is true either I use the log of cumulative inflation and inflation decides. And I'm using again the cross-section of politicians. Then I also want to use the panel dimension of the time series dimension of the data because you can collect this data from 1949 until today. That's what we did. So we also see that when inflation tends to be relatively higher in the period in which the speech is given, politicians that are elected represent constituency that have higher inflation in the 1920s tend to give more speeches about inflation. You see here the interaction term between historical inflation and contemporaneous inflations, where the dependent variable is the number of speeches on inflation, is always positive and statistically significant. So when inflation, in a way, is a salient topic for politicians, which we measure, inflation rate is high when a politician gives her speech or his speech, the number of the politician or himself is gives speeches that tend to contain, that are more likely to contain the word inflation. Then we look also the role of the local press, and we see here that in areas where the newspaper is located and it experienced high inflation in the 1920s, this newspaper is also more likely to give articles about inflations. Then, very briefly, I think the time is start to run out. So we're going to look whether the experience of the 1920s also matter for financial decision of households today. And we're going to use one of the surveys that contains information about financial decisions of households. And we see that we find an effect on bonds, which is that. So in principle, households living in areas that experience high inflation in the 1920s are less likely to buy fixed income type of claim. Then, last part of the analysis, we try to generalize our findings. So, as I told you at the beginning, we believe that Germany is a great place to test whether inflation in the 1920s may affect inflation expectations today. But of course, there are also specificities of Germany that may affect our results. So what do? We're going to look also at Poland and see whether we're going to find similar results for Poland in a specific way. So I will show you in a second. So the good thing about Poland, one of the surveys that we are using for Germany is also available for Poland, the JFK. But this is a map of Poland today, but you see the darker areas of Poland today were Germany in the 1920s, when Germany was going through the high inflation period. And again, here you have cities for which we had data in the 1920s with historical inflation rate, darker shades, higher inflation in the 1920s, lighter shades, lower inflation in the 1920s. So what do? We do two things. We look at the Polish data, and we relate expected inflation of household individual eye in Poland today with the experience of inflation in the same city when Poland was actually, a piece of Poland was actually Germany. Then we do a second, this is the baseline test. What everything you saw before, we are applying it to this Polish data. When we are doing something on top, we exploit the fact that German people, especially after World War II, were displaced. So it was a wave of forced out migration of German people out of a previously German area, now Poland, into other areas of Poland. And we're going to see whether this plays a role in explaining our results. Here is what you find. So the baseline is in column 1 and column 2. You see that there is still a positive relationship between expected inflation rate and the experience of the 1920s in these Polish cities that were Germany in 1920s. The point estimates are similar to what we find for Germany, but as you can see, we don't have statistical significance. Well, let's move to column 3 and 4. Column 3 and 4 adds to the baseline of column 1 and 2 an extra interaction term. Log inflation type percentage of German people that have been displaced after World War II. And what you observe is that the baseline goes back to be strongly positive and statistically significant or marginally statistically significant. What you see is that the effect tends to be less strong in areas where there were more forced out migration of German people, where more of the German people have been moved out and relocated in the areas of Poland, or sent back to Germany. The effect tends to be smaller. And this is, you see it because the interaction term has a negative and statistically significant coefficient. So the association between inflation in the 1920s and expected inflation rate today tends to be stronger in areas where there has been less out migration of German people after World War II. And I think I'm reaching my conclusion. So wrap up. So what did we do? We study current household inflation expectation in Germany, and we relate them to the 1920s inflation, hyperinflation episode. We find that inflation expectations are higher in areas that experience high inflation in the 1920s, and we find some evidence suggesting that this effect is driven both by intergenerational mechanisms, but also local institutional or collective memories. You saw the role of politicians and the role of the press. Main message. So if at least part of our inflation expectations are rooted in the historical experience, probably central banks will have a more difficult role, a more difficult task in managing our own expectations, because it looks that at least a part of it looks to be stubborn and difficult to be changed. So central banks' communication becomes very, very important. And maybe this is some sort of negative type of expectation. Some of the adjustment will have to be done on the normal Phillips curve, because inflation expectations indeed tend to be sticky. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Fabio. Perfect timing. And there is already a queue of questions, which I will start summarizing. The authors of the questions, if they think I haven't been fully clear about what they wanted to ask, feel free just to send me another message, but I'll start. So there's two questions which are effectively the same, by Orkun Saka from City University, London, and Clemens Jost from Vienna. And it's essentially what explains the observed variation in local inflation in the 1920s, right? So Clemens in particular asked for an order of magnitude, right? What was the variance of local inflation in Germany in the 1920s? And if the variance is large, how do you explain that prices effectively decoupled between geographical closed areas in what one would expect to be an integrated national economic space? I guess you're going to quote your previous paper on the topic.
Yeah, correct.
Yourself.
So can I still share my slides? Because I was expecting this question, so I have something to say. So, by the way, sorry for the coffee, but I was sick until a few days ago. I'm going towards the end of my slides, and I need to quote my previous paper, a previous paper that Nick, Felix, and I had on inflation, because there we tackle the question. So, but yes, so there are differences. There are differences among cities, and the differences tend to be important. And how do we explain them? Here we are. So this is a table which I'm shamelessly taking from a previous paper. It's, I think, table 3 in that paper. And here we relate local inflation, a CTI, and time t between 1920 and 1924 to different city characteristics where we have data. So what do we find? We find that larger cities, okay, I say it again, larger cities tend to have higher inflation. That's one. Then we find that some evidence of what I will call a local Phillips curve. So I'm already moving to column 3. A local Phillips curve. So the higher is the unemployment rate, the lower is the local inflation, which is evidence of a local Phillips curve, which has already been found, also been found in current data in the US, for instance. Then I'm going back to column 2. Occupied. Occupied is a dummy variable, wherever city C at time t has been occupied by the Belgian franchise. And we see there is a positive relationship between occupied and local inflation. This, to an historian, I think this makes lots of sense, because part of the resistance, the German government financed by directly shipping their bills, so that people wouldn't work, but still survive, because you don't want to work for the Germans or the Belgians. Then I'm moving to column 4. If a city had a branch of a German central bank, the city also experienced local inflation. How do you interpret this? You are closer to the money supplier. That's the way we think about it. So these are the 1920s again. So money is banknotes, is physical. So it has to be physically be delivered. And we found out that actually were the local central banks, amongst others, responsible in delivering the banknotes. And then we dug a little bit more into it. So we also know at a certain point, papers and printing presses were taken to print the banknotes to be distributed. And so we saw that in cities that have a higher percentage of people employed in printing, at least, have also higher inflation, again suggesting that the local availability of money, of banknotes, has an impact in increasing inflation. Then column 6 puts everything together and horse race them. And what you see, what survives is, if you're occupied, still is you have higher inflation, you still have a local Phillips curve, and surprisingly, also printing presses still matter.
Indeed, that was my favorite result of your paper.
Oh, thank you.
Now, Stefan Gerlach has a question about the left-hand side variable. Is the dependent variable expected inflation over, say, the next year, or perceptions of the current inflation rate?
Is expected inflation next year, as taken from his surveys.
Stefan, if you want to come back and explain better why you asked the question, just send me a message and I can. But until then, Yassine Tosun notes that your results show no relation between local inflation in the 20s and your very ingenious measure of current inflation. And then asks if there is a similarity between the dynamics that create inflation in these periods. I guess the sources are very different, so I'm not sure you're capturing the same thing.
Yeah, so for us, this is just a test to be sure that realized inflation today is not explaining my results. So I'm showing there is no correlation. Now, I guess there are some differences in how prices were formed back then and today. So today, I guess things are more likely to be priced nationally, especially with big supermarkets, where maybe apply a national policy. And that may explain why we don't find too much cross-sectional variation of local inflation in the 1920s in explaining the cross-section of realized inflation today. That doesn't mean that inflation expectations don't matter for realized inflation. The experience of a 1920 doesn't matter. Everybody with his own expectation may nationally contribute in raising the inflation rate. You just don't observe a cross-section. And that's what you want to say. Now, having said so, we already got this question. So we try to make, so we are, let's say, we are powering up our measure of realized inflation and getting additional data in additional year to have a longer time series and a larger cross-section to test this idea better.
Okay.
I don't know if Nick wants to intervene here, also feel free.
Yeah, at any point, Nick, just unmute yourself. But since you mentioned before urbanization, so there's a question from Bill English from Yale. Is there more that can be done with population shifts? Cities, for example, would have more immigration and internal population shifts. More rural areas are more likely to be relatively static. Does the effect stand out in the cross-section?
Yeah, so unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, there are no data on internal migration from city to city in Germany. And this should be coupled with the surveys. So we look into this. At the moment, we haven't found good data to see whether or not your grandparent was living in a low inflation city and then he moved to an high inflation city, whether this is affecting your expectation. This, unfortunately, didn't find it, but we are looking for it. So that would be, yeah, that would be nice. Poland, in a way, tries to address this. So the test with Poland, amongst other things, so tries to address this type of idea. We haven't checked still the split between rural and urban, but that we can do it, actually. So this question already come up, is on our to-do list, actually.
Right, but Bill has a return. Can you see a weaker relation for cities than for rural areas?
I don't know yet. We haven't tried it yet.
Okay.
But we can check.
Good. So I also had a question about immigration, and it has to do with, right? I got excited when I saw Poland, but then you did just the reverse, that what I expect you would do.
Okay.
Right, so you try to find the effect of the German hyperinflation in essentially the areas that were then incorporated in Poland after World War II, Silesia, Pommern, East Prussia. But I thought it would be more interesting, especially to test your intergenerational mechanism, to do the reverse, right? To try and identify the expelled Germans from Poland, right? Whatever they settled, both in East and West Germany.
Yeah.
Right, and see whether that experience relates with the local level of inflation that you're showing on this picture.
That we can try. Yeah, I think I need to ask Nick for the data, whether the JFK survey will allow that, but I think that can be done. Maybe if Nick wants to say something about it, I think that in principle could be done.
So Rui, you're basically asking whether we can focus on Germany and then in Germany identify those who migrated from Poland, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's a very clear spatial pattern to today's Bundesrepublik distribution of right? So it's essentially Bayern and Baden-Württemberg against.
Yeah. So we haven't tried this, but yes, I think we could.
If you could, I think that would be fantastic, right? Because at least it would be a way of isolating the local effects in the in today's Germany or at the time.
Yeah. But by the way, Rui, if you want, we don't have Poland here. But when we look at intergenerational transmission, at least if your parents are born abroad, could be also Poland.
No, I know that. But this reduces your effect. I just want to see, it's like one of those second-generation immigrant regressions for the US.
Yeah, understand.
Right? What happened to the inflation expectations of Germans today who have a family background from Upper Silesia? Does it correlate with the Upper Silesian inflation and not with the inflation experience of whatever they're living, outside Stuttgart?
Yeah. Clear, but we can do it. Thanks, Rui.
Right. Okay, but while we were talking, the pile of questions keeps on growing, so this is good. Elena Segeza, so she has two questions. So you say that you take in consideration the cumulative inflation from January 20 to December 24.
Yeah.
It suggests stopping at the end of 23 when prices stabilized. And among the control variables for your contemporary data set, family wealth is introduced, but it would also be used to take into account the liability side, right? The indebtedness and the structure of wealth. financial or real, right? You use this as an outcome variable, but not as a control, if I understood correctly.
I need to double check this. So we have household wealth. I don't remember whether we have also if this is gross wealth or net wealth. Nick, do you remember this? Because I think that's the question.
This is net wealth.
It's net wealth.
Net wealth.
So we don't itemize between gross wealth and debt, but we have net wealth. So we take in control. So depending on the survey, of course, information is available, but we do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, stopping 1923, yeah, we can do. We tried it. Given 1923 prices stabilizes, not a big deal.
Okay, so Elena has another rejoinder, so I'll just ask next. So this is essentially a question about, I guess, the exclusion restrictions, as it were, right? So today's inflation expectations depend on the experience of consumer inflation 100 years ago. You show that. But these expectations are not influenced by the house prices and stock prices 100 years ago. Current inflation expectations influence today's portfolio choices. How can we explain that these choices are not influenced by past trend in house and stock prices during the hyperinflation itself?
We can control for that. We can try to one thing is also the stock. So stock price is a tricky business because stock prices are a national variable. So to the extent we are controlling for real fixed effect, that's going to be picked up. So in principle, I should have a local measure of stock index, which may be measured by how families invested in different cities, or getting data hopefully from local stock exchanges and see whether local stock market had any impact. House prices, yes. So we can try to work something out with some historical data. It's patchy, but we can think about a measure to introduce there that can help. But yeah, point well taken, yeah.
Right. So Gustavo Cortes starts by saying, Fabio, fascinating results. Well done. On the politician's channel of collective memory, have you thought about time as a modulator of the memory effect? For instance, German politicians speaking in 1949 about the hyperinflation, which was only 2 decades ago, may have had more persuasion than those speaking about events many decades previously. Do the results get stronger in the early decades due to this temporal proximity, or is the effect the same across the time you observe this?
We can check. Well, thanks a lot. We can check.
Okay. Great. Next in line is Guillaume Dodin. Guillaume has 2 questions. I will ask them in sequence. So you make the point that inflation is more difficult to manage because of memory, right? But he's not sure that you actually show that. You have shown that inflation expectations are higher in some places and lower in others, but it doesn't think that you have shown that inflation expectations are higher in general, or more sticky or flexible.
Yeah, okay, this is a fair point. So it's not in a presentation, but it is in a paper. So to stick with the time, I need to make some choices. But we have a couple of results showing this. So we look also at VAT changes. So maybe I can very quickly show you a table that goes a little bit in this direction.
Yeah.
Let me get there. Here it is. So there has been, especially during the Merkel era, different VAT changes, which we know that they tend to affect inflation expectations, right? So if I raise my VAT, people expect prices to go up. If I lower VAT, people expect prices to go down. Mm-hmm. So what we did was, this is the equation, expected inflation IT equal to constant local inflation in the 1920s times whether there's been a VAT change, yes or not, okay? And then we differentiate between an increase in VAT and a decline in VAT. We separate the things. What do you observe? So we don't find any cross-sectional difference depending on historical experience on whether you cut the VAT. So again, remember, the dependent variable is expected inflation. So looks like there is not much difference going on here. Yet, when VAT goes up, it looks like that expected inflation tends to raise more in area that had higher inflation in the 1920s, suggesting that this inflation tends to be stickier. It tends to be more pessimistic in average and not really optimistic vis-a-vis the others, which goes in that direction. But we also find that when inflation is higher, people living in high inflation area in the 1920s raise their inflation expectation more than the others. They tend to be more sensitive to that, which goes in that direction. So that's our way to try to show that.
Great. Guillaume's second question. So you use data from the 1920s, or rather data from the 1920s was used as a basis for wage negotiations, right? That's why
that's what we know. Yeah.
So the question is about, whether the data was biased because of this, right? So maybe it depended on the political influence of local industrialists who do not want to increase wages and ask for lower inflation expectations. This might explain the urban-rural difference. And in particular, he also noticed that Bavaria, right, is conspicuous, right? And Bavaria was, you say, it's very rural. Could you check this?
So, yeah, good point. So we look into that, and we actually collected the papers used by the statistical officer to collect the prices. So it cannot be lobby because the goods that are used and the weights are the same across locations. So it cannot be that an industrialist in Kiel is pushing for a certain weight than a farmer in Bavaria. So if you're very precise, so the type of goods that are included tend to be a list that makes sense. So from milk to meat, various degrees of vegetables, also some durable stuff, but so it looks like it makes sense. So, but the important part is the statistical office came out, put this list all together, and the list was the same for everybody. So at least locally, you don't have differences. And if there is some lobby, it has to be nationally, but then it becomes a little bit less clear how it's going to bias things. And we have no evidence of people lobbying for that. Yeah,
this is sort of an Argentinian question, right? Was someone locally lobbying, even if the composition of the basket was the same, right? Was actually someone perhaps for the prices to be lowered.
I don't have an answer for this. I don't have evidence, so we can check. I don't know if Nick knows more by looking at it, but what I can see is for sure the weights were no different across cities.
Fantastic. Next in line is Rebecca Stewart. She thanks you for your interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And she says central banks today know that the general public cannot judge the level of inflation when forming expectations, and they largely ignore these expectations without serious effects on policy outcomes. However, the public is good at identifying turning points in inflation, and these can be much more useful for policymakers. Have the authors looked at the effect of memory on turning points rather than the inflation level?
No, but we can think about it. It's a good point. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Then we can check. So we just went into a typical expectation literature, but that's a good point. We can certainly look into it. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. So that was the last question on the queue. We are coming to the official end of the seminar. There you are, 6 o'clock. So we want to thank Nathan and I and all the members of the steering committee, all of you who attended the seminars live or that watched them in YouTube later on. Although this is the end of this series, the good news is that we'll carry on. Next semester, we'll start at the end of August, and the information will be distributed in the usual way. So thanks a lot, and we look forward to see you back in August. But we always give ourselves 15 more minutes to carry on any unanswered questions. And I think there might be a bit more, so we'll carry on. So in particular, I just wanted to go back to my spatial autocorrelation, right? These things look very autocorrelated, but you probably, test for that. But
so, yeah, good point. We do actually. So we tried various Conley specifications with different thresholds. So in the baseline, probably you saw it, the standard errors are clustered at the county level.
Yeah.
It tends to be more conservative than the Conley standard error. because the county one both takes care of spatial, but also time series correlation. It looks like the time series is bothering us more than the spatial.
Yeah.
The spatial t-stats becomes way higher, actually.
Yeah. But let me just be provocative and ask you, imagine that you're writing a different paper. You're writing a paper about the political influence on long-term expectations of inflation, or rather on the long-term effect of politics on inflation expectations.
Okay.
Right? So earlier I said that, you look at your map, it really looks Bayern and Baden-Württemberg against
The south, yeah.
And we know that Bayern and Baden-Württemberg have been essentially ruled by the CDU, right? With very strong majorities, right? So maybe this is an alternative mechanism, right? So you looked at the speeches of the of the MPs. I don't know. I mean, Germany is not really the UK, right? I know that the members of the Bundestag are elected locally, but I wonder how much variation there is across within party, right? And this is related to Bob Schiller's idea of these narrative entrepreneurs, right? So isn't the ongoing the remarkably persistent political control of the CEU over the south of the country perhaps connected to this memory of inflation? That's actually the mechanism that then is to today's expectations.
So possible. Notice that we are a bunch of politician control. Maybe Nick, if you remind me, what are they? I think the political party, we may control it actually. So this is even controlling by political party. We still have the effect. And notice this is per politician. So the SPD most likely had also representatives from Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, and even controlling by the political party, we do find the results. So it looks like, yeah, for sure you're correct. Now, if I wanted it to be beautiful, but I cannot do it now, I would like to show you my point estimate of interaction term with and without party control to see how much it matters. I will tell you at a certain point, but
okay.
Well,
you can turn the question around. Are areas within states that had higher inflation in the 1920s more likely to vote for the CDU, and the ones
we tried so
for the SPD?
Yeah, so okay, this we didn't do it. I think we tried a regression with alternative for Germany. Not much was coming out, but we're just a trial, right? So
okay, great. So I see Nathan. I don't know if Nathan wants to join the discussion.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just had one question, like something to understand, and a comment. So when you look at these elasticities that you report, so obviously when you're dealing with hyperinflation, it's I mean, so there's huge variance in inflation in the 20s. It's not a linear estimate, and these things are very. So how do you? I mean, this is a technical thing. How do you compress this, or how you kind of
it's a good point.
Some elasticities of a 2% inflation from annual from 1,000% monthly. So and again, a lot of variance. So that's one comment about technical thing I wanted to ask. And the other thing is more kind of a following Rebecca, kind of a more of a policy related comment in terms of so if these inflation expectations don't affect local inflation, so that's what you show, right? Historical inflation affects expectations, but expectations don't affect actual inflation in a significant way. So so in terms of the policymaker, so two things. One, the policymaker, I guess, for them, it's not. It just say that in Germany, because of the past inflation, they somehow discount expectations to some extent, yeah, because they're just formed based on some historical persistence, which is not very relevant today. Is that how you would frame this from the policy perspective? Is that there's some kind of a bias, historical bias, and let's discount it? And again, once we moved from the Bundesbank to the ECB, this is even more probably watered down. And I haven't been to the monetary debates, monetary policy committee at the ECB, whether this is even further watered down when the German representative, the governor, is asking for tighter policy, and the neighbors say, oh, it's all based on this historical stuff, and it doesn't really, these are two questions.
Okay, Nathan, thanks. So question number one, the technical one. So in a way, so we thought about it. That's why we always control, we have two measures of inflation. One is the log, which still, by being a log, less like large variance, as you said. When we use inflation decile, so basically, we assign cities in bucket of inflation, 10 buckets of inflation, from lowest to highest. And that's a way to compress, because in the highest, you may have still lots of variance, but you still get the highest dummy, and the lowest. Then you can use it in the regression in two ways. Either use it non-linearly, so each bucket is a dummy, and one will be a base dummy. That can be done, it works. Or in order to avoid too many coefficients, we just use it linearly. So bucket one, changing from bucket one to bucket two, from bucket two to bucket three is the same, because we treat this linearly. And still we get the same result. So that's one way to go. The second question, very important. So I do not claim that inflation expectations do not matter for realized inflation. The equation here is relating realized inflation in CTI to local inflation in CTI in the 1920s. I don't put inflation expectations there. And I find no I don't find no relationship. Now, why is that? So first of all, I'm not claiming that inflation expectations do not matter. I'm just telling you, when I look at the cross-section, local inflation in the 1920s doesn't explain the differences of realized inflation with our measure. Now, one possibility to interpret this result is maybe pricing these days has become more national. So you can live in Stuttgart, I can live in Kiel, you're more pessimistic than me. We both contribute to the national price level, but we don't see dispersion between Kiel and Stuttgart. That's, I think, what's going on.
Well, I mean, just a quick follow-up. I mean, you could actually, if you have the data, parse it out to non-tradables, like haircuts, those kind of things, where you might find a little bit less.
With the new data, we'll be able to do it. That's correct.
Parse it into these non-tradable restaurants or whatever, to see whether this is one of the channels. Yeah.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, we can do it.
Yeah, I just have one final question, which is very obvious, right? Which is East versus West, right? So there's a very big political difference, right, for 40 years between the two parts of the country, right? Did you try testing that, whether the effects are more attenuated for people that went through state socialism and so on?
Well, there is a paper that just looks at the socialist non-socialist experience that has been published on the GME. It finds that East Germans tend to be more pessimistic than West Germans about inflation. So this is just by looking East-West.
Mm-hmm.
We can try and interact. So in our case, we could try an interaction term, 90-20 experience East-West, which we didn't do it, like a rural-urban. So that can be on the to-do list.
Okay.
To see whether the experience has been amplified by.
Yeah. No, I know that you have state fixed effects, but this is,
Yeah, no, but this is a different, this is splitting.
Yeah, we not only have state fixed effects, we also have, we actually know, at least in some surveys, we know where people lived before the reunification. So we also control for that.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So it's similar to the Polish question. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. That's great data. Okay. I thought that Germany was like Switzerland, right? Because here there's still a difference, a legal difference between the canton of birth and the canton of registration. right? So if you move to Geneva and you were born in another part of the country, your official documents always say, you know, the canton of birth. So could be, but maybe this data is no longer kept in Germany. All right. Don't think we have any more substantive questions on the queue. If someone wants to ask a question, please type quickly on the Q&A, because I'm not seeing anything more related to the paper. No, nothing else. So, well, again, thank you very much for bringing yet another interesting paper. We had a blast with the previous one.
Yeah.
And another blast with this one. So keep on coming.
Oh,
yeah.
Thanks.
With German data. Or
I still owe an answer to Nathan about the previous one. So
okay.
I
wow.
went to the vacation later. I still remember. Yeah, so
great.
Nathan wants to stay online.
Okay, guys. So have a great summer and look forward also to see you back in the fall. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.